30th of October 2013, Wednesday evening, 6:43 p.m. On a quiet lane in Macclesfield, a teenager was found collapsed in the road. Passing drivers thought they'd come across a crash, but the truth was darker, and the tragedy was that it had been carried out by people he thought he could still trust. 9 years later, 21st October 2022, Friday night, just after 11 p.m, in a Birmingham cul-de-sac, a young father staggered to his neighbour's doorstep. He had been stabbed again and again. Within minutes he was gone. 2 murders in different towns, but both are tied to the same world of drugs, debt and betrayal. This is the story of Zain Sailsman and Jamie Benbow, and how, after complex and relentless investigations, police tracked down their killers and brought them to justice. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Before the killing of Zain Sailsman, police had already been watching 2 names rise through the shadows. They were still in their early 20s. Charles Bedell and Ricky Jervis were not the kind of figures you would expect to build an empire so young, but both already carried violent reputations. The pair had grown up immersed in the undercurrents of crime, where carrying weapons, dealing small amounts, and settling disputes with threats was second nature. By their late teens, they had records that spoke of aggression and an instinct to dominate. Together, they found ambition in something more lucrative than petty fights and street-level dealing of crack cocaine and heroin. The commuter towns of Cheshire, with their quiet estates and steady flow of cash from Manchester and Liverpool workers, offered a ripe market. Bedell and Jervis saw it and were pulling in more than £30,000 every month. Their reach was spreading into Macclesfield, Knutsford and beyond. They operated like businessmen, but with the ruthless mindset of enforcers. Their network wasn't built alone. They forged a crucial link with William Dale, a canal barge dealer who had discovered the profit in moving drugs in bulk along waterways. It was Dale who became their supplier, bringing in larger quantities of heroin and crack that Bedell and Jervis could cut, package and distribute. Together the supply lines were stable and the profits continued to climb. But money was not enough. Intimidation became their language. Reports of gunshots fired to send warnings, young recruits being tasked to carry out assaults, painted the picture of 2 men who wanted to be feared as much as they were respected. Their empire was small compared to major city gangs, but in Cheshire's commuter belt, it was enough to make them untouchable, and it would not be long before one wrong move would bring everything crashing down. The empire Bedell and Jervis were building needed soldiers, and one of those pulled into their orbit was a teenager named Zain Sailsman. Zain was just 19 years old. To those who knew him outside the criminal world, he was remembered as a young man with energy, a cheeky grin, and a passion for music. He had coached local kids' football teams, performed as a rapper in Macclesfield, and was known in his community by face, if not by name. His mother and sisters described him as loving, lively, and full of character. But behind that smile was a teenager caught in a dangerous slide. Like many others, Zain's path into crime wasn't sudden. It was gradual, a mix of temptation, pressure, and exploitation. Bedell and Jervis saw in him someone young enough to be impressionable, but old enough to handle the dirty work. He was recruited at street level, dealing crack and heroin in the commuter towns that kept their operation running. For the bosses, Zain was considered as a disposable layer of protection. But Zain was more than just a dealer. On the street, he gained a reputation for acting as an enforcer, a boy tasked with collecting debts, issuing threats, and even sometimes using violence himself. For his family, this dual life was painful. They saw the boy they loved drifting further into dangerous company. He was at once a victim of exploitation and a participant in a trade that devoured young men like him. By the autumn of 2013, Zain's role in the gang was no longer just about dealing. He had been drawn into their violence, and it was one decision, an act of betrayal, that sealed his fate. In October, Bedell and Jervis used Zain in a job that carried far higher stakes. A rival's house had been marked. The message was meant to be loud, brutal, and unforgettable. Zain pulled the trigger of a shotgun, firing into the property. Inside were not just adults, but children, youngsters who, by luck alone, escaped without injury. The blast ripped into the home, an unmistakable warning in the language of gangs' dominance through fear. Afterwards, the weapon was buried. In the criminal code, such firearms were to be hidden, preserved, and handed back when demanded. But Zain had other ideas. Quietly, and without the knowledge of Betrayal or Jervis, he dug the shotgun out and sold it. To him, perhaps it was quick money, but for them, it was the ultimate act of disrespect. When word spread, the response was immediate. In their world, loyalty was everything, and betrayal was answered with blood. Threats began circling around Zain and his family. At home, the family lived in fear. They locked the doors and checked the windows repeatedly. They feared petrol bombs through the letterbox or men coming to the door. For Betrayal and Jervis, the message was clear. Zain had broken the code and undermined their authority. He had made money from their trust and put them at risk. So the intimidation was not just about scaring him. They were to set an example. That autumn, the motive for murder crystallized. What began as a teenage recruit they could control had turned into a liability they could no longer tolerate. Fearing the threats against him, Zain tried to escape. For a short time, he fled to Blackpool. It was a desperate attempt to put distance between himself and the gang who now saw him as a traitor. By the seaside, he stayed away from the streets he knew, hoping the anger directed at him might cool. But Betrayal and Jervis had no intention of forgetting. After some time, Zain came back, and gradually they pulled him in with promises and reassurances. He was told he was still one of them, that there was no grudge and no feud. Surrounded by criminal influence, the thought of being cast out or even hunted was unbearable. Against his instincts, he agreed to return to Macclesfield. On the night itself, Zain climbed into a car driven by Julia Howard, the girlfriend of Charles Beadle. Officially, the story was that they were looking for the missing shotgun. Zain thought he was going to find it, to settle things, and to prove himself again. But there was no gun, and the trip was a trap from the very start. Howard sat in the driver's seat, making the meeting look normal, as if it was just routine business. For Zain, that detail felt reassuring, because Beadel's girlfriend was there and it seemed less dangerous. But the truth was different. The car carrying Zain and the others left Macclesfield and drove out towards Bullocks Lane, a quiet stretch edged with woodland. To anyone watching, it looked ordinary. A young man with friends, but in reality, it was the stage chosen for his execution. They stopped, and Zain was led into the trees. Julia Howard remained behind the wheel, while Beadle and Jervis pressed him further about the missing gun. Tension simmered as words were exchanged. At the height of the confrontation, Charles Beadle pulled a knife. Without hesitation, he drove the blade into Zain's back. The wound was devastating. It pierced deep, severing a major artery. Zain tried to get away. He stumbled forward and fought to stay on his feet. He moved from the trees back onto the road, leaving a trail of blood behind, and within seconds, his strength gave out and he collapsed on the tarmac. At 6:43 p.m., passing motorists spotted him lying in the road. At first, they thought it was a hit and run. A young man sprawled across the lane, injured, a car nowhere in sight. Drivers pulled over, some rushing to help. But as they reached him, the scene told a different story. His injuries were not those of a crash. They were the injuries from a stabbing. Emergency services were called. At 6:43 p.m., officers and paramedics reached the scene. Drivers who had stopped stood nearby in shock. Zain was rushed to hospital, but he could not be saved. A post-mortem confirmed it was a single stab wound that had killed him. The road was sealed by police and the hunt began. On the other hand, Beadle and Jervis had already fled the scene. The knife was gone too, or perhaps discarded, and it was never found. Howard drove them far from the area, carrying with her the knowledge of what had just happened. When investigators arrived minutes later, the scene was haunting. and within hours, detectives knew they were dealing with a gangland execution. What began as confusion on a dark lane soon became a methodical investigation. Piece by piece, detectives built the case. The first breakthrough came from Zain's phone. Detectives traced his recent calls and messages. In the days before his death, there was frequent contact with both Beadle and Jervis. One exchange stood out. Zain had voiced his fear that he was being set up. Jervis replied with reassurance, convincing him it was safe. For the prosecution later, those words became a turning point. They showed intent, and they showed how Zain had been lured back into danger. The second lead came from the car. On the night of the murder, Julia Howard, Beadle's girlfriend, had been behind the wheel. Police quickly identified her role. When questioned, the story she offered was that they had been searching for a missing shotgun, but the weapon never existed. Detectives soon uncovered the truth. It had been a cover story, a way to put Zain at ease and to justify the journey out to Bullocks Lane. Forensics added more weight. The knife used to kill Zain was never recovered, but traces of evidence tied the suspects to the crime. Clothing linked to Beadle and Jervis placed them within the timeline. The vehicle, too, showed signs consistent with the movements described by witnesses. In addition, residue from the earlier shotgun attack on a rival's home connected the same circle to escalating acts of violence. The wider context gave motive. Police already had intelligence on Beadle and Jervis. They were known as ambitious drug dealers. With phone data, Howard's testimony, forensics, and motive tied to the gangland world, the picture was complete. For the police, it was enough to move in. And soon, the first arrests would follow. The first wave came within hours of the murder. 3 men, 2 aged 22, 1 aged 21, were arrested on suspicion of murder. They were brought in for questioning as officers began tightening the net around Beadle and Jervis. At this stage, police were working through every possible lead, but the weight of phone data and witness accounts was already pointing towards the 2 main suspects. On 2nd November 2013, just 3 days after Zain's death, the first formal charge was made. Ricky Jervis, 22, from Congleton, was charged with murder. The other 2 men arrested earlier were released on bail while inquiries continued. 2 days later, the investigation struck again. On 4th November 2013, Charles Beadle, 22, of Macclesfield, was also charged with murder. That same day, detectives widened the scope of the case. 2 women, aged 26 and 35, and a 23-year-old man were arrested on suspicion of assisting an offender. All 3 were later released on bail as the inquiry into the cover-up expanded. The arrests did not stop there. On 12th of November 2013, police confirmed 2 more suspects had been taken in. A 24-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of murder, while a 23-year-old man was arrested on suspicion of assisting an offender. Both were questioned in custody as officers pieced together movements on the night Zain was killed. By mid-November, the case had grown into a web of suspects, witnesses, and supporters. But at its core, the charges against Beadle and Jervis stood firm. With Howard's involvement exposed, the phone evidence secured, and the gangland motive established, detectives believed they had their killers. The case opened at Chester Crown Court. For 6 weeks, the courtroom heard all the case details, what we have already covered. In May 2014, the verdict was returned. Charles Beadle and Ricky Jervis, both 22, were found guilty of murder. Each was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 27 years before parole could even be considered. Julia Howard, 26, who had driven them that night, was convicted of assisting an offender. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The wider network also faced justice. William Dale was jailed for 14 years on serious drugs and firearms charges. Other associates were mentioned in news articles, but nothing specific was reported about their sentences. only that they were jailed for perverting the course of justice and firearms offences. Our second story is about a 29-year-old Jamie Benbow, a roofer by trade, known locally for his easy manner and the kind of presence that made people feel at ease. To those who knew him best, he was a father before anything else. His family spoke about him as a loving dad, someone whose young son would now grow up without him. His sister remembered him as a big-hearted man who would do anything for anyone. Friends called him caring, loyal, and always ready to help. Jamie's life, like many in Birmingham's suburbs, carried its contradictions. He was described in court as dealing drugs on a modest scale, often to friends and acquaintances around the Beaufort Arms pub on Old Walsall Road. It was a sideline that brought him into contact with others in the trade, people who on the surface appeared to be friends, but behind closed doors saw rivalry and profit. Among them was a 38-year-old Calvin MacLeod, a man with a violent history and a reputation of his own. He had a record that stretched back years, with convictions for robberies, for carrying offensive weapons, and for grievous bodily harm with intent. He had already spent time behind bars, and those who knew him understood his tendency towards violence. Where Jamie's trade was modest, MacLeod's ambition was sharper. He too dealt drugs, and the pub became their common ground. On the surface, they seemed to get along. Many who saw them thought they were friends. Behind the scenes, though, the balance was fragile. MacLeod saw an opportunity in Jamie's position. A rival who knew the same streets, the same customers, and the same circles was also a rival who could be taken advantage of. Court hearings would later reveal that whatever bond they had meant little when weighed against greed. MacLeod decided that Jamie's presence in the trade was not something to share, but something to exploit. For Jamie, the danger wasn't obvious. The overlap with MacLeod's world gave the illusion of safety, that their shared connections made them allies. But MacLeod's past was a warning in itself and in his eyes, and Jamie was not a friend, but a target. This connection would prove critical in the later part of the story. The groundwork was being laid for a betrayal that would unfold not in a pub, but on Jamie's own doorstep. By the autumn of 2022, the tension between Jamie Benbow and Calvin MacLeod had reached a breaking point. Jamie dealt drugs in small amounts, but he also kept money and product at home. For MacLeod, that was something to exploit. The plan was simple in its cruelty. MacLeod would have Jamie robbed in his own home, stripped of drugs and cash. But he wouldn't do it himself. He knew Jamie would recognize him instantly, and that recognition could unravel the scheme. Instead, MacLeod kept himself deliberately at a distance. His role was to set the pieces in place and let others carry out the dirty work. For that, he turned to two men. The first was Jerome Christie, a 27-year-old from Derby. Christie had a reputation that followed him: involvement in gangs, brushes with drugs, and a history of violence that made him a useful recruit. The second was Ravel Hutchinson, just 26, from Birmingham. Hutchinson was no stranger to blades. He had prior convictions for carrying knives and threatening with them. To MacLeod, these two men had the combination of ruthlessness and anonymity he needed. Before the night of the attack, the groundwork was laid. Christie and Hutchinson travelled with MacLeod to Jamie's neighbourhood. It wasn't to confront him, it was a reconnaissance trip, a chance to identify the house, to see where Jamie lived, and to prepare for the real strike. With his hood up, MacLeod kept his profile low. He didn't want Jamie to spot him. The planning was precise. They would strike at night, when Jamie was most likely to be home, alone, and vulnerable. On the surface, the plan was robbery. But in practice, it was more than that. This setup would eventually turn into a brutal assault. What Jamie thought was just another evening at home would soon become the final moments of his life. October 21st, 2022. Jamie Benbow was last seen at the Beaufort Arms pub. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that night. After leaving the pub, Jamie returned home. He had no reason to expect what was coming, But as the clock pushed towards 11 p.m., the trap was set in motion. Two men, Jerome Christie, 27, and Ravel Hutchinson, 26, pulled up outside. Their hoods were raised with deliberate movements. Acting on the orders of Calvin MacLeod, they forced their way inside. What followed was a brutal robbery turned execution. Jamie was attacked with a knife, sustaining 18 separate wounds. The fatal blow drove deep into his chest, piercing the upper right side, the strike that ended his life. His body bore defensive wounds, clear evidence that he fought back, trying desperately to save himself against two armed intruders. Bleeding heavily, Jamie staggered from his home. He tried to reach safety, collapsing on the doorstep of a neighbor's house. Despite frantic efforts by neighbors and later paramedics, he was beyond saving. At just 29, Jamie Bembo died where he fell. For his killers, the robbery had succeeded. They stole money and drugs before fleeing the scene. For his family and community, it was the moment their lives shattered forever. In the hours after Jamie Bembo's murder, West Midlands Police launched a major homicide inquiry. Washington Drive, usually a quiet cul-de-sac, was transformed into a crime scene. Forensic tents were erected, officers secured the area for evidence, and detectives went door to door, speaking with neighbors who had heard or seen fragments of the brutal attack. It didn't take long for the pieces of the puzzle to surface. Just a short distance away, in a nearby park, officers recovered a knife believed to have been used in the killing. Forensic analysis would later show that it matched Jamie's injuries, tying it directly to the attack. The search for evidence also turned to motive. Inside Jamie's home, it was clear that robbery had been at the heart of the crime. Cash and drugs had been taken. This wasn't a random killing. It was planned, targeted, and motivated by profit. Then, detectives worked quickly to connect the dots with cell site analysis. Phone records revealed a chain of communication between Calvin MacLeod and the two men who carried out the attack, Jerome Christie and Ravel Hutchinson. Messages and call data placed MacLeod in contact with them before and after the murder, painting him as the orchestrator who had set the robbery in motion while keeping himself away from the scene. For Christie and Hutchinson, further evidence came in the form of their movements after the killing. Surveillance and witness accounts showed them leaving the scene, then taking steps to dispose of incriminating evidence. Clothes worn that night were destroyed, and the stolen money was divided. Piece by piece, the homicide team built their case. It all pointed to one conclusion. This was not a crime of passion or a spontaneous fight. It was a robbery for gain, fueled by greed and enforced with premeditated violence. Within days of the killing, police moved in. Calvin MacLeod was the first to be arrested and formally charged. As the investigation developed, Christie and Hutchinson were also tracked down and taken into custody. By the spring of 2023, all three men stood accused of murder, awaiting their day in court. In the days after the murder, tributes flooded Washington Drive. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes lined the cul-de-sac, many with messages of love and remembrance. Friends wore white t-shirts printed with "Justice for Jamie and Bembo 29 Forever," turning grief into a public show of solidarity. The case against three killers came before Birmingham Crown Court in June 2023. For 6 weeks, the jury heard all the details about the series of events and the overwhelming evidences. When the verdicts were returned, all three were found guilty of murder. Passing sentence, Judge Francis Laird KC spoke of betrayal and greed. He told MacLeod that despite his outward friendship with Jamie, he had orchestrated a violent robbery motivated only by profit. He described the killing as a murder for gain, cold and ruthless, and condemned the callousness of sending others to carry out such a brutal act. Calvin MacLeod, 38, was given life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years. Jerome Christie, 27, received life with a minimum of 28 years. Ravel Hutchinson, 26, was sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.